now we know some of the elements that go into the knowledge creation process. So, for example, we know that there should be some definite objects of knowledge, and we also know that there should be some legitimate means of inquiring into this knowledge, and we also know that there should be some legitimate doubt about the inquiry. So, now let us try to put these all together and try to come to understand what was the framework of knowledge creation that the Nyaya Darshana had come up with. So, the unique contribution of the Nyaya Darshana was that it came up with a robust framework for new knowledge creation. So, if you see the very first sutra of the Nyaya Sutras, some 16 categories are given in that. All of them are in some way or the other related to the knowledge creation process. What are all the various things that we must take care of in order to come up with a new, in order to establish a new claim? So, we can start off with the psychological features, what I would like to call the psychological features, which are the first thing is that you should have some end in sight, which is the prayojana. It is called the prayojana, which is the first of the category mentioned over here in this diagram. So, you should know that I want to achieve this thing. So, the purpose which we want to solve based on this knowledge creation exercise, that is called the prayojana. Now, in order to solve that prayojana, in order to get that prayojana, if you already have a well established knowledge, you wouldn't set out to create new knowledge, isn't it? It's only because you have some doubt you are going to get some new knowledge. So, that element of doubt is called samshaya. We have already seen what are the various causes or reasons that, or what are the various forms that our doubt can take. So, we do something in order to resolve this samshaya. What that something is, we will see in the next slide. But once that samshaya is resolved, we come to something called as a siddhanta, or we come to something called as a tenet, which is now confirmed. Till now it was only a hypothesis. Now it has entered the let us say our standard textbook, or it has become peer reviewed and it has gotten published. And now this siddhanta will go as part of the well accepted new bank of knowledge that is there, which is called nirnaya. So, once we start off with a prayojana, we want to solve some particular problem. We are unable to solve that problem because we are doubtful about the means by which we will be able to solve that problem. Once we resolve that ambiguity or that doubt, we will come to something which is now a well accepted conclusion, that which is called the siddhanta, and that siddhanta now enters the existing bank of knowledge, which we can then call it a nirnaya. Now, what do we do in order to resolve this ambiguity? Remember that the pre-modern Indian tradition was largely an oral tradition. So, how would you think that the doubts are resolved in an oral tradition? It is mostly through a argument, or it is mostly through a debate and discussion. So, when I use the word argument, please don't take the normal connotations of that. Generally, people confuse argumentation with quarreling. It is not the case. When two philosophers argue, or when two thinkers are arguing, it need not be a quarrel all the time. So, an argumentation here is an exercise that these thinkers enter in order to remove the ambiguity. Now, the Nyaya philosophers gave a detailed account of what are the different kinds of arguments that you can have, and what are the various elements that are allowed and disallowed in an argument. So, they gave even procedural details. So, the central pillar that you see over here with the prayojana, samshaya, etc., that may be considered to some extent at least the psychological features which drive the knowledge creation process. This argumentation that you see over here is the procedural aspect. So, now that you are having some sort of a motivation to create knowledge, how do you go about doing that? So, the procedural aspect is covered in this particular box. Once this procedural aspect you set about doing this argumentation, etc., every argument needs to have certain logical features. Just because you are arguing, you cannot throw in each and every statement that you have, or each and every kind of argument that comes to your mind, you cannot say. It must follow a systematic procedure. You must follow, first you must set out the hypotheses, you must tell what are your reasons, you must tell if you have any existing previous instances where you have observed the thing. So, you should set it out in a given way. You should avoid the fallacies that are there. you should show proper examples to support your hypotheses. So the logical aspect is covered in the third box. So the Nyaya, when it gave the 16 categories in the first Nyaya Sutra, the 16 categories that you will see, most of them are covered in this frame that we have presented here as a framework for new knowledge creation. It covers the psychological part, the procedural part, as well as the logical part. So we have already seen what are the various types of samshaya, etc. In the next parts we will try and see what are all the various logical aspects, but here in this particular part we will see the procedural aspects. We will try and get some details about this procedural aspect. So as I said, in the oral tradition, the knowledge creation process happens via discussion and debate, etc. So the Nyaya tried to categorize what are all the different types of arguments that we can have. But firstly, who are the participants of the debate? There is a Vadin, who is the person who is setting forth the thesis, and there is a Prativadin, that is who is the opponent or who is responding. It need not always be an opponent, it can be a respondent also. Both of them are trying to create knowledge. In such cases, that person is not necessarily an opponent, they can be called a respondent also. So these are the two people involved. So it is assumed that in an argument at least more than one person should be there. Arguing with one's own self is, though in language we say, as the Nyaya has set it out, it is assumed that there is at least one more logical entity is there. And based upon the purpose for which we argue, the Nyaya classified the argument into three types: Vada, Jalpa and Vitanda. Though they gave this classification for oral arguments, we can also have the same classification for written work also. So what is the distinction between Vada, Jalpa and Vitanda? So all of these three can be called the categories of argument. The general name for an argument, if you say Katha, then you can have one type of argument called Vada, which is a very positive discussion, Jalpa, which is something little bit of a negative discussion, and Vitanda, which is a completely negative discussion. So why do you call something as a Vada? A Vada is a very constructive kind of a dialogue which happens between two parties. Both of them have come together in search for the truth. So there is some ambiguity that both of them want to resolve. I have one hypothesis, my colleague has another hypothesis. Both of us want to find out the truth. Neither of us wants to establish their own knowledge, but we just want to find out what is the truth. So we enter the discussion. I set forth my reasons, they set forth their reasons. Both of us argue over here, and the argument must follow a particular set pattern, and the hypothesis that we are forwarding should not be in contradiction with what we already know. So these are some of the characteristics of a Vada. So if there is a hypothesis, there is a counter hypothesis. One of the two is supposed to be agreed upon. It is hoped that one of the two will be agreed upon, and whatever is agreed upon should not be in contradiction with what is already known. And in the argument, we must follow a particular set pattern of argumentation. That kind of a argument which is aiming at the truth, that kind of an argument is called a Vada. The argument which is having all of these properties, but an argument in which I want to propose my hypothesis, or I want to substantiate my hypothesis, my friend wants to substantiate their hypothesis, that kind of an argument is called Jalpa. In Jalpa also, all these steps, systematic procedures, etc., all of these things are there, but the aim over here is not to reach the truth. In Vada, the purpose or the aim that we want to achieve is that we want to know what is the truth, whereas in Jalpa, we don't care about truth. I want to establish my hypothesis, my friend wants to establish his or her hypothesis. So when that is the case, you are allowed to use some tricks. Okay, you are allowed to use chala. Chala is some sort of deliberate, twisting the words of the opponent. So if my opponent is using some metaphorical utterance, let us say, I will take it literally and try to refute them, or try to say that therefore their thesis is unacceptable, etc. Or I will try to use one word in a very uncommon way or in a different way For example, words have different meanings, right? So I will try to, if my friend is using the word in one sense, I will deliberately interpret it in another sense and therefore reject that argument. Or I can say that they are using a false analogy, which is called jati. Jati is a false analogy. So as part of the argument, you are supposed to give some examples or analogies. So I will try to find small mistakes, very superficial mistakes in the analogy given by my colleague. So that kind of a trick is called a jati. And I will try to use some things called as nigrahasthana. So for example, if my opponent is taking too long to respond, then I will say, hey, this fellow is taking too long to respond, therefore I have won the argument. Or I will say, hey, this person is repeating what he has already said, therefore I have won the argument. So these kind of rhetorical tricks I will use in order to win over the opponent and establish my position. So just to recap, in Vada, the purpose is to go for the truth, is to search for the truth. Whereas in Jalpa, the purpose is to establish, I want to establish my proposition, the opponent wants to establish their proposition. Distinct from this is Vitanda, which is a kind of argument in which I don't even have a hypothesis. My only aim is to refute the other person. Whatever the other person says, I say, no, it's not acceptable. If you do this, this will happen. So I don't have a thesis of my own. So for example, I am having the hypothesis that light is a wave. My friend has the hypothesis that light is a particle. If we were entering into a Vada, both of us would try and find out what is the true nature of light. That is what we would find out. Whereas in a Jalpa, what would happen is that I will try to substantiate reasons for why light is a wave, my friend will try to substantiate why light is a particle, and both of us will be stuck in our own place. Whereas in a Vitanda, I don't even have any knowledge, I don't even have a hypothesis about what light is. I just want to refute that light is a particle, that's all. So that kind of an argument is called Vitanda. So in some of the Indian languages, this word is still there. Don't do this, all this Vitandavadi like that we say. Means he is a person, whatever you tell, he will tell some, or she will tell some counter and demolish your argument. So that kind of an argument is called Vitanda. So as you can guess probably, in order to create new knowledge, it is always recommended that we enter the Vada kind of an argument rather than the Jalpa or the Vitanda. The Vitanda is purely an intellectual exercise, just to see how robust or how good your thinking is. To some extent, we can jokingly also say that the Viva that is conducted in the colleges is something like a Vitanda. So we can say, so just to test how strong the person's intellectual abilities are. But if our objective is to go search for truth, then the kind of argument that we should enter into is Vada, an argument in which I have one hypothesis, my friend has another hypothesis which is contradictory or contrary to mine. Both of us present systematically the evidences for our hypothesis and then try to come to some conclusion whether this hypothesis is accepted or that hypothesis is accepted. So this kind of an argument is what is recommended by the Nyaya Sutra. So in the next part, we will try and see a few more details about what are the logical aspects that go into making of the Vada kind of an argument.